They say power wears many uniforms. Mine just wasn't visible that morning. I had pulled over to the side of a quiet road outside Arlington, Virginia, still in my running clothes. Sweat clung to my brow. I had just finished my usual 5 a.m. jog near the Pentagon and stopped to check my phone. Bad signal, bad timing. That's when the patrol car rolled up behind me. No sirens, just lights. I barely glanced at it. I wasn't speeding, I wasn't in anyone's way. I figured maybe they needed help or were checking on me. I couldn't have been more wrong. 2 officers stepped out, both young, both tense. "You mind telling us what you're doing here?" one of them asked, hand already near his belt. I showed him my military ID. "Lieutenant General Grace Covington," I said calmly. "I'm stationed at the Pentagon." They didn't even look at the card. The other officer moved around behind me. "That doesn't explain why you're parked off the shoulder," the first one pressed. "Step out of the vehicle." I wasn't in a vehicle. That should have been obvious. I had nothing but a water bottle and my phone on me. "I'm not in a car," I replied. "I was jogging. This is federal property. I'm here every morning." But they weren't listening. "Hands behind your back." The cuffs were cold. I felt them clamp tight over my wrists before I could protest again. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I've led troops into combat zones. I've briefed presidents. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They never asked my name again. They only realized something was wrong when a black SUV with Pentagon plates screeched to a halt behind them. And out stepped someone they never expected. The doors of the SUV flew open with military precision. A tall, stern-faced man in a dark suit marched toward us, his ID already out, glinting under the rising sun. "Release her." "Now," he barked. The younger officer hesitated, his hand still on his holster. "Sir, you were just detaining a United States Army general without cause," the man interrupted sharply. "Do you have any idea who she is?" The silence was brutal. I didn't speak. I stood there in cuffs, calm, still breathing slow from the run, as the man, my aide, Colonel Renner, snapped open a folder with my credentials, clearance level, and deployment history. He held it like a mirror to their mistake. "She leads the Joint Special Operations Command Cyber Division," Renner added, voice sharp as a blade. "She holds 3 security clearances you'll never even hear of. And you've just put your careers in a chokehold." The officers scrambled to unlock the cuffs, mumbling half-formed apologies. I didn't flinch when the metal came off. My wrists were red, sore, but I didn't rub them. I just looked at them, no anger, no fear. Just disappointment. One officer stammered, we didn't recognize her. She wasn't in uniform." "She doesn't need to be," Renner said flatly. "You don't cuff anyone for standing on the side of a public road without cause." I finally spoke. My voice was even. "I gave you my name. I showed you my ID. You didn't even look." They lowered their eyes. I walked toward the SUV without another word, stepping into the back seat as Renner closed the door behind me. Inside, my phone buzzed. It was the Secretary of Defense. He had already heard. And he wasn't calling for clarification, he was calling for accountability. The line clicked, and I heard his voice, calm, deliberate, but charged. "Grace, are you all right?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "Physically." He exhaled slowly. "I was briefed 10 minutes ago. Your aide did exactly what he should have. I've already spoken to the Chief of Staff. We're not letting this slide." "I'm not asking for a spectacle," I said. "You won't need to," he answered. "But we're not sweeping this under the rug either. A judge signed off on their patrol unit's conduct pattern just last week. I've just placed a call to that judge." I raised an eyebrow. "A direct call? Direct line?" He owes me a favor. I looked out the SUV window. The two officers were still standing on the curb, staring at the pavement like it might open up and swallow them. Their supervisor had just arrived, too late to contain what had already escalated far beyond routine protocol. The secretary continued, "Grace, they didn't just stop a citizen. They detained a decorated officer, a commander, without cause, without ID verification, and without a shred of judgment. And they're going to answer for it." "I don't want retaliation," I said. "I want standards. And consequences." "That's exactly what you're going to get," he said. "The judge is calling a hearing. Internal Affairs has already been notified. There's also a press request coming in from 3 networks. I'll defer to your judgment on how public this becomes." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Let them run it," I said quietly. "But I won't give a statement, not yet." "Understood." As the call ended, I sat back in the seat, silent, watching the city move past the tinted glass. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. But this time, it wasn't going to be buried. 3 days later, I walked into the courthouse in full dress uniform. The media had set up outside, but I didn't stop for cameras or questions. I wasn't there to perform, I was there to be seen. To remind them all that discipline isn't a one-way street. The courtroom was quiet when I entered. The officers, Miller and Hartley, sat with their department rep at the front. Neither looked up. Judge Sorensen, a no-nonsense man with deep lines around his eyes, sat perched behind the bench like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole career. "This is an internal disciplinary hearing, not a criminal trial," he began. "But make no mistake, what happens here sets a precedent." He turned to me. "Lieutenant General Covington, would you like to make a statement?" I stood. "My name is Grace Covington. I've served this country for 27 years. I've led joint task forces overseas, advised presidents, and commanded some of the most sensitive missions in our defense strategy. But 3 mornings ago, I was treated as if none of that existed." I paused, scanning the room. No theatrics. Just truth. I gave my name. I showed valid identification. I was not resisting, nor violating any law. But they still put me in cuffs. Not because of what I was doing, but because of what they assumed. The judge nodded solemnly. "The issue here is not a matter of mistaken identity," I continued. "It's a failure of process. A failure of professionalism. And a failure of respect, for both the uniform and the Constitution." Miller finally looked up. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I sat down without fanfare. The judge turned to the officers. "Do either of you have anything to say?" Hartley tried. We didn't realize who she was. It wasn't personal." Sorensen's voice cut through the silence. "And that's the problem." He turned to the record. "As of today, Officers Miller and Hartley are suspended without pay pending a full departmental review. Their field certifications are revoked until completion of a federal retraining program. This court recommends the department reevaluate their suitability for service entirely." He closed his folder with a sharp snap. "This hearing is concluded." The courtroom emptied slowly. I stayed seated for a moment after the gavel fell. The silence felt heavier than applause ever could. There was no victory in what had happened, only a necessary correction. Outside, the reporters surged forward, microphones outstretched. I stepped to the podium, adjusted my uniform, and spoke clearly. "I'm not here today as a symbol. I'm here as a reminder," I said. "Respect isn't earned through assumption. It's earned through action, every day, in every encounter." A murmur passed through the crowd. "This incident should have never happened," I continued. "But since it did, we're going to use it. To retrain. To restructure. To restore what too many have forgotten, the burden of authority is accountability." I didn't take questions. Back at the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense met me outside the west entrance. No press, no cameras. He simply said, "You did more in 5 minutes than some do in 5 years." I shook my head. I didn't do it to make noise. I did it to make room. For the next woman. The next soldier. The next citizen. He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. By the week's end, the department had announced mandatory recertifications for field conduct across the district. Quiet changes began happening behind closed doors, training manuals rewritten, body camera reviews standardized, escalation procedures restructured. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't overnight. But it was a start. And as I laced up my shoes for the next morning jog, I felt something different in the air, not safety. But vigilance. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can wear, is silence that follows justice. 2 weeks later, my inbox was flooded. Emails came from cadets, junior officers, civilians, even retired colonels I hadn't heard from in years. Some shared their own stories, quiet, buried moments when they were dismissed, ignored, or restrained despite credentials and calm. Others just said, "Thank you." But what stood out most was the memo that came from Joint Command, effective immediately. All military identification presented during field stops must be logged, verified, and honored with expedited protocol review. Non-compliance will trigger automatic oversight response. It wasn't just policy. It was a line in the sand. Behind closed doors, I met with Defense Oversight, Justice Department advisors, and Pentagon leadership. Not to make it about me, but about the failure of instincts in the field. We didn't need louder sirens. We needed sharper eyes, better minds, and fewer unchecked assumptions. Later that month, I was invited to speak at West Point. I stood before a sea of uniforms, men and women who might one day face a similar moment of decision, on either side of that badge. You don't get to control who you meet out there, I told them. But you do control how you meet them. Silence followed. Not out of fear, but understanding. The cadets stood when I finished. Not as a formality. But in respect. Not for a general. But for a standard. The story faded from the headlines within a month, pushed aside by louder scandals, elections, and the usual churn of breaking news. That was fine with me. I didn't need fame. I needed follow-through. One afternoon, I received a small envelope in my Pentagon office. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of notepaper, military issue, the kind cadets still use. Written in neat, deliberate penmanship were 7 words, "Ma'am, I saw. I'll do better. Cadet TH. No fanfare. No hashtag. Just impact." That note stayed with me. Not framed. Not on display. Just tucked in the side pocket of my duffel bag, the one I still carry every time I deploy or travel in civilian clothes. Because that's the truth they don't print, change doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes with a decision, repeated in silence, again and again, until culture shifts and habits follow. Sometimes it's a pause before unholstering. Sometimes it's a second glance at an ID. Sometimes it's a hand not reaching for cuffs. That's how we win. Not by being feared. But by being remembered. 3 months passed. No cameras followed me now. No reporters waited outside my door. The world had moved on, but I hadn't, not entirely. There was one more thing I needed to do. I visited the precinct. Not with an entourage. Not in uniform. Just in plain clothes, black slacks, white blouse, and the same calm I had the morning I was cuffed. The desk sergeant looked up when I walked in. Recognition flickered across his face. Word had clearly traveled. "I'd like to speak to Officers Miller and Hartley," I said. He hesitated. They're in mandatory retraining. I can call someone from internal, no need, I interrupted gently. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here to leave a message. I pulled a sealed envelope from my coat. On the front, it read, "To be opened after certification." Inside were 2 handwritten notes. Short. Firm. Human. To Officer Miller, awareness is not weakness. Learn to lead with it. To Officer Hartley, instinct can protect or destroy. Choose wisely. No signature. No rank. Just the truth. I handed the envelope to the sergeant. Give this to them when they're ready. He nodded slowly, silently. As I turned to leave, a young recruit who had been watching from a hallway, barely out of the academy, stepped forward. "General Covington." I stopped. He looked nervous. Then said, "Ma'am, thank you. For not giving up on any of us." I nodded once. No speech. No moment. Just a quiet walk back to the sidewalk, wind tugging at my coat. Because real command isn't about reminding people you're in charge. It's about leaving something behind that still speaks when you don't. 6 months after the incident, I was asked to deliver a classified leadership briefing at Fort Meade, a closed-door session for a group of rising intelligence officers and field commanders. The topic wasn't strategy. It wasn't cyber warfare or logistics. It was judgment. Inside the secure room, the air was still. Everyone present had clearance. Everyone had rank. But today, they were there to listen, not speak. I stood at the podium, placed a single photo on the projection screen. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a mission. It was a grainy still frame from a dash cam, the moment I was handcuffed. I let the silence stretch. Then I said, "This is what happens when authority forgets context. When power skips confirmation. When instinct isn't trained." A few jaws tightened. Some looked down. Then I tapped my tablet, changing the slide. Next image, a handwritten note. 7 words. "Ma'am, I saw. I'll do better." This, I said, is what happens when leadership is witnessed instead of shouted. The message landed. Not as a reprimand, but as a responsibility. When the session ended, several officers approached me, not to shake hands, but to ask how they could implement what I had said in their own commands. I gave them practical steps. Real directives. Quiet change agents. One of them, a major with a sharp mind and steady voice, said, "Ma'am, what you taught us today, it won't just shape protocol. It'll shape instinct." That's when I knew. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become theirs. And with that, the mission was complete, not on paper, but in the people now carrying it forward. The morning of my retirement, Arlington was quiet. Not silent, but calm in a way that let you hear yourself think. I arrived early, before the others, before the ceremony, before the speeches. In my office, there was one last thing to do. I opened the drawer beside my desk and pulled out the folded piece of notepaper, the one from Cadet Th. It was creased now, worn at the edges, but the ink hadn't faded. "Ma'am, I saw. I'll do better." I placed it into a sealed envelope and wrote one name on the front, "To the next commander." Then I left it in the top drawer, right beneath the commissioning documents and operational briefings. No announcement. No instruction. Just a reminder that leadership isn't about being remembered. It's about making sure someone else remembers what matters. As I stepped outside, the flag detail was already in formation. My successor stood waiting near the podium, hands behind her back, her posture straight and her eyes calm, but focused. She'd read the files. She knew the story. We exchanged no words. She didn't need them. I walked past the line of saluting officers, nodded once, and exited the compound not as a general, but as Grace. No sirens. No convoy. Just a civilian again. But somewhere behind me, a new standard had been set. Not through force. Not through fear. Through presence. Through example. And through one moment where everything nearly went wrong, but ended up showing what right could look like.